machines is sitting that they could work with. And if those people had a job working with what we have for them to work with, they could produce the rebuilding of our cities and many of our other needs. What does it say about an economic system that can't put together unemployed people, unused resources to produce and fulfill our unmet social needs? That's a system that doesn't work. And whether Karl Marx said it or somebody else said it is really, I think, secondary. Last point on competition. How are we competitive? How are we competitive in the world? Well, it's really not very complicated. If you can buy a car that is more or less the same as another car, but it costs substantially less, you'll probably choose the cheaper one. Sort of what people do. What makes a car cheaper? Well, here we go. It's the costs that go into it and the profit that the producer puts on top of the costs. The cost of the labor, the cost of the materials, and here's that last part, the profit. Now, for the United States to be competitive in the world, it would have to, let's pick an example, automobiles. If people around the world were going to be buying, including Americans, more Chevys and Fords instead of Toyotas and Volkswagens and so on, that would have to be the price. How could you bring down the price of the American car? I got news for you. Here's a couple of ways you might not have thought about. You pay less to the shareholders in dividends. You pay less to the executives in bonuses. If those costs were reduced, the car's price comes down. In all the discussion of competition, we always hear, to be competitive, we can't pay the workers the wages. This is very peculiar, because at the very period of time that the workers' wages haven't been going up, it's the employers' bonuses and stock packages that have gone crazy. If you want to make American goods cheaper, stop paying obscene amounts of money to the people who have relatively little to do with producing those goods in the first place. That's a way to become competitive. Is it the only way? Will it have consequences? It isn't the only way. It will have consequences. But there are consequences from sticking it to workers. So if you're worried about competition, there are a lot of ways of addressing competition. And indeed, if the workers themselves were in charge of their enterprises, my guess is they would never have permitted, and they wouldn't permit today, any group of managerial types to have salaries that are 300, 400, and 500 times more than the average worker gets. They wouldn't allow it, and if they brought all those down, American goods would once again be perfectly competitive with those in other countries.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. It's 8:57, we have to be out at 9. So red shirt, and then in the black.
It seems like this is what you're saying, but I'm not sure. So you think that, or you believe that restructuring work and some other social changes, you can gradually change the economic system through the currently existing political system?
So my question is, one, I mean, if you're talking about Silicon Valley, you're talking about Microsoft and Apple, I mean, maybe you're just talking about as models, but I mean, those were startup companies, millions of dollars, and had Bill Gates and a poor person who grew out of the garage, and they produced those computers in China and sweatshops, and they made tons of money. So I hope you're just using that as a principle. But my question really is, I mean, if you're proposing an entirely different system where ordinary people run the society in their own interest, they run the banks in their own interest, they run the corporations in their interest, they run production in their own interests, and at the same moment you're throwing out every single past revolution as an example, how on earth could this change take place without a social struggle on the proportions, say, that you saw in Russia? I mean, you did have workers running the factories. You have similar things like this happening in Argentina, and the state is what's coming down to crushing them, and the workers are having to fight back. And how could this take place without a social revolution?
Good questions again. Let me deal with the second one and come back to the first one if I could. By all means, my point was to get across that it is a model, having workers pull away from a traditional capitalist enterprise, and so, and there are plenty of those that happen. Indeed, many of them are quite successful and have lasted for a long time. If any of you are really interested, there's a whole literature and a whole global movement to have enterprises like this. This is not something that's a utopian fantasy for the future. The one that's most famous actually takes place in Spain, in the northern tier of Spain, just below the border with France. And the name is Mondragon, M-O-N-D-R-A-G-O-N. Been around for 50 years. It now involves 100,000 workers in enterprises, each of which the workers themselves own and operate. Very successful. And there are examples all over the world, including here in the United States. When you set up such an enterprise, however, suppose you're successful. Suppose you do real well and you expand, and now you got lots of orders, your stuff is selling. You're now going to get some more people. You're ready to expand. It's a kind of a moment of truth. Will the new ones that come in, will they be like you, equal, or will they come in as the employees of those who began the firm? At that moment, you got to decide, are you going to stay with the new model, or are you going to evolve back into a form of the old model? Some companies go one way, some companies go the other. The question is, how would a movement that was self-conscious about itself, how would it function? Now, Argentina, quickly. In Argentina, there was a total economic collapse, a little bit like here, only worse, a few years earlier. And what happened there is remarkable. The capitalists left. They closed down the factories and they pulled out of the country. They moved to Brazil or France or somewhere else. And the workers were without work. And then a movement kind of out of nowhere began. The workers, and by the way, if you're interested, Naomi Klein is a person you may know her work. She and her husband, Avi Lewis, made a film called The Take, T-A-K-E. You get it, it's available anywhere, DVD, it's called The Take. It's about what happened in Argentina. The workers went back into the factories that had been closed sometimes for a year or two, with cobwebs and rust and everywhere. The workers took over the factories, got them running again, and ran them as workers-owned factories. The economy recovered. The capitalists came back and said, that's ours. And the workers said, not anymore, it isn't. And then, as the question rightly says, a struggle ensued, and the government sometimes goes one way or the other. It's still being fought out right now as to which way it'll go. So this raises then the correct question. What was I saying? I was talking about reorganizing production. I wasn't talking about the larger political picture. And you're quite right. I am reacting to a long tradition of thinking that the only alternative to capitalism has to do with what the government does, with changing who owns things. What we call in economics macro questions, questions about the society as a whole. If I had the time, I would explain to you why I think the socialist and communist experiments to this point haven't proved successful and are not a model. Because they focus so exclusively on the macro, they never change the organization of production at the base of society. Therefore, my focus is on that. It's on what other people haven't understood, haven't changed. In Russia, what happened is this. You had a revolution in 1917. The workers came and they did the following. They said to the bosses, Monday morning, don't come to work, managers and bosses, because you're not wanted here anymore. We're taking over. The workers then marched, literally this is what happened, the workers marched to the Winter Palace, the place in Leningrad where this happened, and they handed over the property to the three leaders of the communist revolution, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. And they said, it's yours now. The next morning they went back to work, and they proceeded to work exactly as they had before. And instead of a board of directors and managers that were privately companies officials, they were government officials sent in by the Bolshevik government. So they reorganized the economy at the top, but the actual condition of the workers in a daily way wasn't fundamentally changed. And therein, I believe, lies the flaw of why they couldn't survive. And so they fell apart because they had made the change at the top, but they hadn't made the change at the bottom. You know, a way to get at this is to tell you a parable, almost like a minister might. Once upon a time, that's how a good parable starts, human beings believed that you couldn't live in a community unless there were one person who ran everything. We called him a king or a czar or a kaiser or whatever. And that person often had conversations with God, you know, like George Bush did, and things like that. And he ran the show. This king ran the show. And it was thought that if you ever got rid of the king, Lord help you, the society would fall apart, civilization would come to an end, human beings